Hi, this is Carrie Brownstein.
This is DJ Premier.
This is Darren Aronofsky.
You got the RZA right here.
Rose McGowan.
Radiohead.
Aisha Tyler.
Tribe Called Quest.
Fred Armisen.
Prince Paul.
Javier Munoz. Seth Meyers.
Frankie Cosmos.
Flying Lotus.
Hi, we're Chaim, and you're listening to the Talkhouse Podcast.
Hello and welcome to the Talkhouse Podcast. I'm Josh Modell. On this week's episode, we've gathered three guys for a very focused discussion about one of the year's most exciting horror movies, Ty West, Tyler Bates, and Tim Williams. Now, Ty West is a director who made his name with a string of what I guess you'd call indie horror movies, though I'm not sure that does justice to the kind of auteurist vision he has. With films like The House of the Devil and The Innkeepers, he revealed a truly singular style. He tried his hand at a Western with the wild and woolly In a Valley of Violence in 2016, but returned to his horror roots this year with a pair of movies filmed back-to-back. X, which came out in March, and its prequel, Pearl, which is just hitting theaters now. For those two movies, which both star Mia Goth, West hooked up with indie powerhouse A24, which, as you'll hear in this chat, made a big bet on these two films, and since this chat took place, have now committed to a third film in the franchise. If you like creepy, stylish horror, definitely check them out. Now, a big part of what makes both X and Pearl work is the music, and that's where the two other guys on this chat come in. Tyler Bates is a composer who's worked on music for an incredible array of films, from 300 to John Wick to Guardians of the Galaxy. But he knows horror too, having worked on Rob Zombie's string of early flicks as well. Bates is also a music producer, having recently done the new Starcrawler album, and he was, briefly, a member of Marilyn Manson. For the more old-fashioned orchestral score for Pearl, he recruited his friend and neighbor Tim Williams, who's contributed to a ton of great film and TV scores over the past decade as well. This chat among these three gets wonderfully granular about the world of film sound. Pearl is a prequel that takes place in 1918, so West wanted Bates to come up with something very old school. That meant real orchestrations and the kind of instruments and musical cues you don't really hear anymore, and it works remarkably well. As you'll hear in this conversation, West really thinks like an auteur. He's concerned with every aspect of his movies, right down to whether the sound of crickets is going to interfere ever so slightly with the score. All of that care definitely shows on screen, and you can hear when these guys talk how much they care about getting things just right. Enjoy.
So Ty, now that you've seen this screened at the Toronto Film Festival and locally in Los Angeles, and obviously the premiere screening, how does it feel to see this movie realized? And are you completely happy with it? Or do you feel like there's something we could have touched on that would have made it better? Because to me, I think it's pretty gosh darn perfect.
Your own movie is a little bit like hearing your voice on tape. Like, I find it all quite painful and cringing. That having been said, this is the least traumatizing movie for me to see that I've ever made. Yes, there are things I wish I could, a little more time in this, a little whatever, but it's nothing that would make a big difference. It's just stuff that you just eventually always give up on, and you're like, 2 dB here, and I could have gotten that one thing, whatever. But it wouldn't mean anything to anyone other than me, knowing that I just wanted to have the chance to do it. But this is the rare movie where I've seen it with audiences, and I've seen my other movies with audiences, and I'm proud of all those movies just the same. But there's something about this movie that is just, I can see it not quite like they can, but I can see it as close to as an audience member as it's ever been. I don't know why that is. There's just something about the movie, and maybe it's because the aesthetic is so far outside of the usual norm these days, but it's been a real treat to watch it and see an audience react to it. And I don't sit there and think about all the things I could have done differently, and I'm very happy with the way it came together.
Right. The litmus test, I would imagine, on this one in particular might be Mia Goth and her response to seeing the film. How does she feel about it?
She has the same feeling I do about it, really not liking watching herself. And this is the one movie, because we've watched it together in several places now, where she's pretty like okay with it. It's always still weird seeing yourself, but I think that she is really proud of the work. And, it's such a commanding performance. I mean, it's so much her movie, and it's really been cool to see audiences react to it and really cheer for her.
Yeah, and we've discussed the concept behind the score to Pearl before it was even filmed. But how did you arrive really at that stylistic approach as opposed to something just contemporary, dark, or something orchestral, but not necessarily embracing the form and the syntax of old Hollywood movie scores?
Yeah, and I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on this too, because it was not like when we said we were going to do 2 movies, I was sure this is the way we were going to do this. Part of it was like once we started making the world, it just kind of became obvious very soon, because once you started putting all those stuff in the frame and framing it up, it started to be like, this movie's going to need a character in the music that is as vibrant as the photography. And that was like very vibrant. And so it pretty quickly revealed itself to be like, okay. And I was like hesitant to bring it up to you because I was like, let me make sure, because I know it's going to go into this. And we had just finished X. And it's really when I started cutting it together, I think I may have dropped in like some, old sort of temp stuff that was like, let's just see if it does what I think it's going to do. And once you heard the sort of like old romantic orchestral score, it was like, yeah. And also I think with X, we were really trying to make a score that didn't sound like anything else. And, while you could say Pearl sounds like, an old style of movie, certainly it doesn't sound like anything else today. And that was really part of the idea with X and Pearl, was to do something that feels like you're not going to get it anywhere else today. I eventually called you and was like, so I think it'd be great if this was actually, a big sweeping orchestral score. And I mean, credit to you, because you're just like, yeah, great.
I know when you commit to something that's what we're doing. That's one of the real pleasures of working with you, besides the fact that you're obviously very intelligent and you know what movie you're making. When a composer works with a director of that mentality, and the director has the support of the producers, it's fun then. It's like being on a frozen lake and knowing that we can skate on it. And actually, Tim and I have worked together in the past where we've touched on writing in this style. And Tim has done some scores of his own that were embracing some of the older language of film score. And he came in and really helped get us home on this one, because we were in such an incredible time constraint. That was maybe the only thing that was a little unnerving. And luckily we had Tim and Greg Preckle, who also backed us up and did a terrific job helping us get it done very quickly.
I think also a big part of X when we were making it was to be craft driven, and was to really let, people who work on movies shine and get to do something that either they do very well or something that they're not often known for doing, but to really embrace the love of the craft. And so even though I knew it was going to be a big challenge to turn around and do something like orchestral like this, I also, knowing you, I know that, it's one of those things where you can see an opportunity to be like, well, if we could do this well, of course, this is great, and you can't ignore the music in this movie. It's not like it's sort of like, well, we scored it quickly just because it needed music. It's very much a defining element of the movie. And I think for a modern audience who doesn't think about that as much, it's hard to ignore in a movie like this.
Well, for us, it was so incredible to be able to write something in a style that was classic Hollywood, because you just, more often than not, it's, can we have some pulse, or don't give us a theme. And for this, what was so great was to be able to go and create something that was classic, where we could take themes and we could talk about, Tyler and I spoke about weaving the themes through and having a theme for the characters and developing that. And the other thing that was amazing for us was, from day one, you said, it's a locked picture. And I can't tell you as a composer how incredible that is, because you can write the best scene you could possibly write with the music, and then it gets cut 3 or 4 times, and suddenly the cue doesn't work anymore and it's lost all its effectiveness. So knowing that the film was locked was such a huge benefit to us, because we could really try and plan out the shape of the score and, work out where to ramp it up and where to pull back. And that's a very rare thing these days to have that.
Yeah, I'm such a proponent of music and sound in movies. And by sticking to a locked picture, it really gives, because you can sort of score a scene in a movie tonally and it can work and make a scene better. But if you are fussing with the picture all the time, you'll never really get it to totally dance with what's on screen. And with a movie like this and a score like this, it was the kind of thing that was like, now when she picks up that prop, the oboe has to do something.
Right.
And when she spins around, the strings have to do something to comment on that, so that it really felt like the characters in the movie were interacting with the music. And that's not the same for every movie, but certainly for a movie like this, it really would take it to another level. And I'm always very adamant about unless there's an emergency, let's lock pictures so that everybody can really add another layer to the movie, rather than just frantically trying to combine two things, which is, it works, but it's not as, it doesn't integrate itself in the way that something like this does, where there's so many great moments where there's a specific swell that aligns perfectly with somebody doing something in the scene. And there's a particular chime on a moment that someone is picking something up and things like that. And the cumulative effect of all that, it just really kind of lets you know that or reminds you at the very least, that score for a movie is not just music in a movie.
To me, it's one of the purest examples of storytelling and emotion that I've been part of as a score. Now, we've discussed this a little bit, but it's very, very rare for a director to write and film 2 movies sequentially, and then, of course, to have 2 come out within the same calendar year. What was the moment where you and Mia decided to write this film when you were setting up X? And how did the concept to set this in 1919 come about?
It's kind of become a bit of the lore of the movie, which has actually been quite a charming, sidebar to the story. But basically, we were going to New Zealand to make X, and that movie was greenlit. And at the time, COVID was at its peak, and New Zealand was a safe place to make a movie. And we had spent all this effort from a production standpoint to get the crew visas and get a crew that was on hiatus of Avatar and line everybody up. And we had all these amazing people, and we were spending quite a bit of money building a barn and a bunkhouse and really prepping a location designed specifically to make X at a time and a place that seemed like it could be the only time it could ever happen. And who knows if it would ever happen again, because the future was very uncertain. And so because we had done all of that, and because the resources had been put into it, you and I did a film years ago called The Sacrament. And when we built the compound that everybody lives in the Sacrament, we populated that with extras, and we made a whole movie there for 4 weeks. And day in and day out, we're watching people hang laundry and go in and out of their houses. And then when the movie wrapped, you just tear all that down and throw it away and go home. And that's a very strange feeling. And so knowing about that and knowing about the current climate we were in with COVID, it just made sense to me that is there a way to make 2 movies and to not waste this opportunity, this incredibly fortunate opportunity we have to be able to make a movie when no one could make a movie? Could we make 2 movies? And I knew we could from a production standpoint, because I knew the second movie would be cheaper, frankly, because we had already built everything. And I knew we had all of the crew, and I knew that they would probably want to keep working. But I had to come up with an idea, and I didn't want to make a sequel because X is a movie about people go to a farm and then all this horror happens. And I couldn't just send more people to the farm and do it again. And so the only way to use all the same stuff was to think how could we work with the characters in that movie? And Mia, who I had cast to play Maxine and Pearl in X, we had been talking a lot about Pearl's backstory, because you don't get really much of it in X. And we had been talking about it just from an acting perspective. But because of that, I had been thinking a lot about who Pearl was prior to the X movie. And I thought, well, there's an interesting movie, is to take the villain from X and make her the star of a prequel. And when I subtracted years from her life, when you go back 60 years, it just miraculously happens to fall at the peak of the Spanish flu in 1918. And we obviously were going through something similar with COVID. And it was a way to make a movie that was not about COVID, but was relatable to everybody truly on Earth at the time. I saw a way in, and I knew that A24, they raised an eyebrow. They were like, that's interesting. And it just became up to me to figure out how to deliver something that was worthwhile doing it beyond just the fact that we could. And so I talked to Mia, and I asked her, if we were to pull this off, would she be willing to stick around for another 3 months to make a second movie? She said yes. I went to New Zealand. Before we could get into the country, you had to do 2 weeks in mandatory quarantine. And I thought, in those 2 weeks, I'm going to write a script. And I wanted to do it with her because she was Pearl. There would be no Pearl movie without her. And so basically, I sat in there and FaceTimed with her every day. And we just collaborated on a script. And in those 2 weeks, we got a draft together. And it wasn't the final draft, but it was the movie. And I came out of quarantine, sent that to A24, and they said, we'll think about it. And we started prepping X. And I just polished it up a little bit. And we went back to them and said, look, we're getting close to making X. If we were to make this second movie, it will be infinitely better by knowing now, because we will be able to incorporate it into X, and we will be able to, there's things we could source earlier, Model Ts and stuff that's just going to be tedious to find. We should just get on it. And in the most amazing, career situation in my life, A24 just completely bet on it. We had not shot a frame of X. They loved the script for Pearl. They liked the production plan, and they just said, yeah, let's make 2 back to back. And so we shot X, and then 3 weeks later, we turned around and shot Pearl.
Do you like staying in the space of the indie films like A24 and of that ilk, as opposed to going for the tentpole ride?
I think this mostly makes more sense to me. I mean, I like to come up with an idea for a movie and then go make that movie rather than sort of jump onto somebody else's movie. Of course, never say never. I mean, interesting opportunities are interesting opportunities. And there's, I'm sure, a big tentpole movie out there that would be exciting to me and an experience in life that would be worth doing. But I'm so grateful to A24, not just for this. I mean, we had never worked before. So for them to bet on 2 movies with me is bizarre, and so it's a real credit to them and their dedication to filmmakers. And, we can all speak to this because we worked on these movies. I mean, creatively, they're nothing but supportive. And if you want to be left alone, they leave you alone. And we were able to lock picture because nobody comes in and tells us not to. They were very much like, if you guys think it's there, carry on because we trust you. It's so unbelievably great to be able to just go after the thing you want to do and see that through and not have people second guessing it the whole time or scared of it the whole time. And so I just feel very lucky to be working with them. And I feel the same way about working with you guys, and that it's like, it's just us talking about the movie. And then I send you stuff, you send me stuff, and we debate about it, and then we finish it.
Well, one thing that is great is like you write, you edit, direct. And I relate to that with my work experience because obviously I love scoring films and television, but I also am passionate about producing records and writing with artists. And I think that strengthens collaborative experiences among people when you have a little bit more depth as far as of experience, which you draw from. And I really felt this year working with you that was powerful for me. So I'm excited about what you're doing personally. I hope you kind of stay in this same lexicon of filmmaking because it's so unique and original. And it's a very rare opportunity to create something that is truly a byproduct of our collaborative discussions. And you're still, while you're very specific about your storytelling, you're very much open to how musically we want to serve that. And that's been great. I know for me and for Tim and on Chelsea Wolf, it was very liberating to be able to embrace your own artistry and bring it into your style of filmmaking and storytelling. I feel like over this past year, Ty, you and I have been able to establish much more of a shorthand because we're past all the initial interpersonal stuff and it's about like getting down to it. And Tim and I also have that where we can practically read each other's minds. Tim definitely did an amazing job and his efforts on Pearl. And I'd say took the heavy end of the furniture because he also orchestrated it. He conducted it and he oversaw the final mix of the score, which I think sounds beautiful, especially recording in Nashville. There are limitations to that compared to, say, recording in London or in Los Angeles. And I think you don't hear it or feel that at all in the movie. It sounds really gorgeous. And we're very, very excited about the end result. Appreciate the opportunity to do something that is so distinct and outside the norm of what's happening in film music right now.
I'm curious just how you started to approach it from coming off X. And I mean, obviously, Tim, I know you came in, in between, but I mean, how did, for you, technically speaking, when we finished a score that was very vocal driven, and couldn't be more different, when you sat down and started working on the first cue. And I'm just curious also for you, Tyler, if you're messing around on guitar and coming up with it starting there, or if you start immediately with sheet paper for a movie like this, it's like where does it for you? Where does it start from? Because it was such a 180-degree turn.
Well, it was a conversation between Tim and I, and honestly, before I got the cue, Tim knocked out like the first bit that ultimately became like our main theme. And when I heard it, I'm like, that feels right. He's like, are you sure? I'm like, it feels right to me. I think we need to just share this with Ty and see how he feels about it, because we knew that in our minds, the idea was to have an overarching theme that is essentially Pearl's theme that's going to serve the entire movie. There is some twisted version of it in practically every piece of music in the film. And to me, it felt, the thing that has I think, drawn Tim and I together through the years is each of our disparate but deep experiences with many styles of music. And also, I think we approach our craft with authenticity, our relationships with authenticity. And I think that had to be transcendent in this music. And so it wasn't a facsimile of, it wasn't trying to ape a riff off of somebody else. It was really taking in the conversation that we had with you creatively and thinking about some of these classic scores that we love. Because I love the old stuff. Maurice Jarre, all that stuff. I love that. I love Aaron Copland, just all that kind of stuff. And of course, you can't help but love Bernard Herrmann if you're a composer. So it's daunting to even say the name in context with your own task, But anyway, it was a fresh opportunity because the 2000s was a drone era for scoring movies. Then I've done a lot of action movies, and that's a lot of pulsing and drums and smash cuts, and musically it serves an important purpose. But in this, it was a chance to start painting, to really work with something that was much more lyrical than most movies allow for. And given that it's a locked picture, you can go much longer lined in your thinking, because if you're working on a picture that is going to be recut about 40 times, once you get into all the technical stuff like voice leading, like where you might change keys on a cut to continue a scene or a conversation, that gets completely destroyed throughout the process. And I've noticed in my own scores, it happens so late in the game that it just feels sometimes like the natural flow of the melodies are out of round. And that's just because the way it had to be edited together to hit the most important cuts. So the benefit of doing that here was amazing. And then, of course, when Tim and I initially got together, we discussed it, and he had a lot of verve going into this one, not trepidation. Right, Tim?
I was so excited because it just brought all the kind of music that I adore, and you kind of hear as you're watching TV, watching old films and things like that. The opportunity to jump in on that was fantastic. And the thing for me that's so wonderful about working with Tyler and in a collaborative environment like this is normally you're sort of, when you work on a project individually, you're sort of just trying to trust your own judgment and find your way through and find music that you think is right. But the idea, when Tyler and I have that opportunity to work together is I can play it for him and he can say, oh, I love this, maybe here, how don't we try this? And vice versa. You don't feel so isolated, and that feedback is critical because you kind of can help, kind of sharpen each other. And, Tyler's been an incredible mentor for me in the film industry, just his depth of experience and also just the way he can look at a picture and really understand what the key story is, what the key moments are, what the key tone should be. And that's something for me I've benefited from and learned from, and has been a wonderful friendship and collaboration.
Going back to the very first thing you talked about, Tyler, and this is Tim, just because I saw you last night at the New Beverly at that screening, and then I saw you 2 days ago in Toronto at that screening. What is it like to sit in a theater with, 1,100 people one night, or whatever it was, 300 people another night, for a movie that's 85 plus minutes of music, going the whole time?
It was electrifying. I mean, I know Toronto's rabid about films, which is incredible. I mean, they adore films, I think to a level that you often don't see. It felt like a rock concert, honestly, because everyone was kind of clapping before the thing even started. That's why I love the theater. You don't get that when you're sitting at home watching it with a friend. You don't get that same kind of electricity. And this crowd was so amped and so excited. And then when you hear the laughter and you hear the screams and you hear the reaction in real time, especially for something that you've been looking at on a screen just in isolation, or, it's very rewarding. Like, it's really exciting to see something connect with people, and moments that, I would look at in the film and sort of laugh at, to hear an entire, audience erupt, or, there's moments in the film where they're gasping together and they're just completely engaged. It's just the best way to see a movie.
There's a very fun sort of feedback loop that the movie gives. And I mean, Mia drives it along, but there's so many moments where, one in particular is obviously when the monologue is done, and everyone is sort of enthralled by this monologue and either aware that the camera has not moved or cut for 6 minutes, or they aren't aware and they're about to become aware. But when it cuts to Mitzi after that, and you could, the energy in the theater is like, it's palpable. It's like every single person in that room is like going through something at that moment. And it's that is really interesting. And then I think in talking to people about the movie, almost everybody, there's a point where when she goes to the dance audition, that just universally everybody's rooting for her to get it. And everyone's very excited about the dance and about that moment. And because of what happens, that she doesn't get the part, the collective gasp when they say, I'm sorry, but it's going to be a no, is really interesting, because, on paper, you shouldn't like Pearl because she's killed a bunch of people and things like that. But you're just so rooting for her. And then even though you could probably assume she's not going to get it, when it finally happens and the sort of shoe drops on her there, I've seen it dozens of times now with people, and it's just a remarkable moment where everyone is just like a mixture of and oh, and it's just, yeah, it's really fun when you know the movie is like speaking to people, and it's involuntary, so you know it's real. They're not faking.
Yeah, it's audible, isn't it? And it's like the whole theater. To that point, I mean, I'm certainly interested because there's two really amazing dance sequences in the movie. If you want to just share kind of how those came about, it'd be really interesting.
Well, there was actually more originally, but the idea of Pearl from X is that she's this villain and she's this resentful, envious, jealous person and homicidal and all of these things. And I wanted to just really see her purely be interested in something that, she loved to do. And it was also interesting to me that she'd be good at it, but not necessarily great at it. And that was a big thing in all the choreography and stuff, was trying to make sure it's like, she should be good at the dances of the day, but there should be a margin of error that it's like, because it's very difficult to succeed at something like that. And I wanted the audience to feel that, because it would be so obvious if she was just like, I want to dance and then could dance, or I want to dance and didn't know how at all and was too scared of it. What's more close to real life, I think, is being like pretty good at something, but maybe not being like world class at it. And then the people who succeed at it are either people who are perhaps undeserving and given an unfair ability to do it, or are this very, very narrow margin of world class people. And so it's like the very unfair group to be in, and then the like in a different way unfair, which is like people who are working every second of their life to do it. And that's a real wake up call, I think, for anyone in any form of the arts, is that it's like, you're either going to be putting in like 100 hours a week on this and still probably failing, and you have to keep going. And you're going to see people who didn't do that just get handed things. And it's going to be psychologically, a lot to deal with. So that was a big part of just the storyline of Pearl and incorporating the sort of show business of it all. We just wanted to see her express herself. And the big dance sequence that we do at the audition, it was really great because we had sort of rehearsed that, but I'd never really seen it all the way through. And I hadn't seen it on a stage in the outfits with everybody else. And it was a real trip to see it for the first time. And then to have the backup dancers coming in and stuff. And we had a great choreographer in New Zealand who knew the era very well. And I don't know, it's one of those moments in the movie that's like most people's one of their favorite scenes. And I think that's also a testament to just Mia, carrying you to that point, and just you're rooting for her so much.
Yeah, she's amazing in that sequence.
I remember when that scene came up when we were watching the film for the first time, and we both kind of looked at each other and our jaws dropped, because it's such a left turn in the movie. You just don't see it coming or expect it, and it's so visually stunning. And we had our work cut out in both that and also the Scarecrow scene where she's dancing with the Scarecrow, because we sort of had to create the music retroactively. We had to sort of time it to the dancing and sort of create everything around it, even though there was sort of a little bit of piano or there was something there. That was definitely challenging to make it feel organic to the scene, but it was such an exciting moment for us to be able to take something like that and really sort of create one of those big Hollywood dance sequences.
Yeah. Mia in that sequence, first off, that's iconic, that whole sequence, but the myriad dynamics, like psychologically, that she's expressing through that sequence is just fascinating to me. Awesome. She's playful, funny, dark, demented, and extremely ravenous.
One of the last cues, we're going to the Scarecrow scene, Tim, one of the last cues we did, you had a great cue for her dancing with the Scarecrow. And one of the last ideas was Wee Wee Marie, which obviously plays a big part in X that Chelsea did a cover of and then plays in the theater in Pearl. I remember texting you, Tyler, and being like, if it doesn't work, it's okay, but can you take one more stab at it, trying to work a sort of waltzy version of Wee Wee Marie in there? And whether or not people get that or not when they see it, I mean, some people will, but even for the very few, there was something really great about that. And then it ended up working because what we had was really good. And it was like, I was like, let's not, tip anything over like this. Just try it, rough it in. If it's not good, we'll just bail. But it ended up being really great, and it adds a whole other layer.
Yeah, it's a great Easter egg, isn't it? And a great sort of connector to the whole, both what she's seen and of course X. So it was a great call, a really good idea.
You always have a point behind why you want to explore a different idea if we want to check it out. So even though it's a lot of work to shift gears, it's always interesting and exciting too to see if we can land that plane. I think that sequence is classic, it's very, very enjoyable too. When you watch it, it's a lot of fun. I think that this movie will be a fun experience for people much more than they may anticipate going in. Mm-hmm. And one thing I've noticed through the years is your sense of humor in your writing. And I don't know how conscious you are about it, but you certainly have never asked called upon me or music to double down on any levity or humor that you want the audience to experience. And I'm curious about what your thoughts are on the inclusion or integration of that into your writing.
I don't know if I consciously think about it that much. It's sort of, I'm always just trying to think of like what scene is making sense for the character in the movie, and then what also is like sort of interesting and entertaining for the storytelling. But I'm never really setting out to make something funny. I think my taste is like, wow, this is kind of a morbid idea, but also kind of amusing at the same time. And I think that they start to stack up. And I suppose, it's the kind of movie that some people could watch and think this movie is really funny and a blast. And then someone else could watch and be like, I'm just offended that anyone could find that funny. I think a lot of it with this movie too is just like a full commitment to what we were doing. And, Pearl is a pretty unstable character, but to put the audience in her shoes and fully commit is like, well, you're going to go along that unstable ride and you're going to see the ups and downs of it. And, there's going to be some irony to that. And there's going to be some hypocritical natures to that. And there's going to be just some black humor to that.
Obviously, the day-to-day life that Pearl is living with her family is pretty grim. So every time I've seen the movie, whether it was in the dub or at a screening, people are getting it. Every time those moments come up, and it allows us to sort of reset, exhale, breathe, and get ready for the next beat of the story. And I think that that's part of why there's so much energy coming from the audience when they see this, because they are allowed to breathe, and then you build that tension up again. And this is a real ride. I mean, X is a ride too, but this is just such a different type of story because it's a period piece and it's very intimate. And I just feel like it's one of the best movies I've ever been a part of. And not all the movies I've done have been good, but there've been some really good ones in there. And it just makes me so excited and proud to be part of it. But yeah, the humor to me is cool because I've literally been emailed seventh chords by people working on a movie and say, hit this chord at that reveal. And it's like, really? That's not going to make it funny. And literally staying out of the way of what is proven time and again, just in these two films, which is great. I hope that people really pay attention to that, especially people working on movies, to see how effective it is to allow the story just to do its job, instead of us having to, double down on what we're already seeing or hearing or feeling. So what did you think about the initial poster that A24 came out with? Because to me, that sold the movie already.
It's the best poster I've ever had for a movie. I mean, it was like right out of the gate, nailed it. It's an iconic poster, and it just as an art piece, it's so like great to have on the wall. I'll be getting some of them in the mail this week, they said, so I'll be sending them over to you guys soon.
Oh, thank you.
Yes, that'd be great. Yeah, and Tim, I think you did an amazing job with the orchestrations because we did have some limitations as to what we were able to accomplish in such a short period of time with the orchestra. I think that's part of why the score sounds so expensive is how well it's orchestrated, because it's a pretty tall task to knock that out in a couple of days where they don't typically play that style of music either.
Yeah. Well, I remember even just the day one when we were recording with the orchestra, just because of the style, that old style, there's this sort of technique called portamento where you kind of join the note. You hear it all the time. They kind of go da-yum, da-yum, they just slide between the notes. And of course, we had some younger players who were sitting there thinking this was kind of a very slow connect. So they were sort of going, do, which is not the style at all. So that was a challenge because we had written it with a intention of that old playability. It was a style that everyone just played in back then and has kind of been lost. So it definitely took a session or two working with the orchestra to get them to kind of get that sound in their head. By day two, they'd gotten it, but just because it's such a different sounding score than what they're used to, it did take a while to get their minds into that headspace.
Yeah, I was just about to stab my eye with a pair of scissors, and then I heard it. I'm like, oh my god, okay, here it is.
The other thing that was fun for us was the ability, just color-wise, to use woodwinds. Again, woodwinds are so neglected, and just the moment you jump onto a score, the first thing that you often hear is, we don't want any woodwinds. They sound too old fashioned. And for me, like the old John Williams scores and all these scores, have this wonderful color of these woodwinds. And especially for this type of score where you have like contrabass clarinet, bass clarinet, all these kind of low, dark woodwinds that just kind of can create this really interesting color down there that you don't hear. For us as composers, that's something that is exciting when you get to use an unusual lineup. You get to use instruments you don't normally, use on typical projects.
For me, that was the woodwinds were, even from our initial conversations, there was clarinets and, I was like, oboes, get out of everything that no one's using, that everyone used a long time ago, because it has such a distinct sound and it has such a distinctly cinematic sound when it works. If it doesn't work, it can be very out of place. But when it works and when it's matching the picture in a way, it's some of my favorite moments of the movies are maybe just the theme coming back in a very small way and just being like, and it's like those little moments, they really just sort of jump off the screen because of that, because you're getting that melody and you're getting it from an instrument that has a very particular sound that you very rarely hear distinctly anymore. And so that was really fun for me. And we were also fortunate. Karen Baker-Landers, our sound designer, and Peter Stalby, our mixer, they were very invested in the score. They really loved it. So when we were mixing, we were able to spend a lot of time and care to make sure that things weren't rubbing with the sound design and make sure that, two things weren't landing on each other that were making stuff wub out too much with some of the horns and things like that. We were able to really, I think, spend time in the mix EQing and play going, the verb on top of this verb is doing something weird. And we don't want that, because in many ways, you really notice the score in this movie, but you also don't notice it at the same time. It's a very fine line of like, you can't leave this movie without thinking about the score, but you also very quickly in the movie stop thinking about it, because it's such a part of the movie that anytime anything rubbed or bumped in a weird way or didn't ebb and flow into a scene, or the fade out just needed another 12 frames because you could hear a dip off of a string. We were really particular about that and really took a lot of care to make sure that the music would sneak in and sneak out in a way that you never thought it ever ended.
Your team is fantastic, because everything is just always balanced. And, sometimes you bring the music really to the front in a way that you often don't get in films. And then at other times, it's just beautifully just supporting and tucked back. And that's a whole nother craft. And this sound mix was exceptional. I know Tyler can share, how important that final sound mix is in, because we can write, whatever the best music ever is, but if you don't hear it,
Yeah, and it was great because they were very good about, our cricket ambience is doing something weird with this, so we need to kill that. And they were never precious about being like, well, we need to hear. They were like, no, it's rubbing against the violins and it's making some weird like feedback situation that if you play them individually, you don't hear it, but if you play it all together. And we got to kill the crickets. We got to kill that wind, because the wind is making it sound like there's a static in something else, and it's modernizing it. And they had just such great ears. And that was most of our time in the mix, was really trying to make sure everything felt clear and separated, and that the music would be in the surrounds and the dialogue was up front, and then they would trade places and things like that. And, that's one of those things that also people take for granted, at how idiosyncratic and esoteric those decisions are to get just right, and to go, those horns sound great, but they're rubbing against the explosion in a way that's making like all the subwoofers do something. We got to pull it out of the sub. And we just took a lot of care to make sure that the score, sat in the movie in the pocket, as they say.
When I saw the finished product for the first time, the score and all of the sound in the movie is so dynamic that you're never fatigued. I've done a number of movies that you can be fatigued because there's a lot of intense sounds. But the spirit of the collaboration that you're describing right now is really how classic films are made. And for the audience, you need different aspects of the movie to come to the forefront and then, kind of hide a little bit throughout, so that it's not just one constant pounding. And I think if sound design and music and the director and the re-recording mixers are all on the same page as far as the storytelling, you end up with something classic. And this movie, to me, is a modern classic immediately. I think when people see this, they're going to feel that this movie will hold its weight forever.
Well, I hope you're right.
I think I am. All right.
Thanks for listening to the Talkhouse Podcast, and thanks to Ty West, Tyler Bates, and Tim Williams for chatting. If you liked what you heard, please follow Talkhouse on your favorite podcasting platform and check out all the great written pieces at talkhouse.com. This episode was produced by Myron Kaplan, and the Talkhouse theme is composed and performed by The Range. See you next time.